Hello everyone, it's Shannon here for Honeybee Stamps. In today's video, we are going to create this rustic card featuring a 3D embossing folder as well as layering dies from the recent release. We're going to focus on texture, create this really gorgeous design. We're going to start with the Woodgrain 3D embossing folder. I love this embossing folder. I'm going to use this a ton. I'm thinking Christmas cards, even used with just white cardstock for a textured background on your clean and simple cards. I think this is going to be so useful. I'm pointing out here that there's kind of two sides, and you can see the side here with that large knot. That side is a little bit more recessed on that large knot. That's the side I like to ink up, but really you can ink up either side. It doesn't matter. Here I am pointing out that large knot, and that's the recessed area. And I'm going to now ink this up with a Distress Oxide. I'm using ground espresso. Distress ink would work here as well. Any dye ink or pigment ink or even hybrid ink would work well for this, but I do think the hybrids or pigments work better because they kind of bead up less. And once I've inked up that whole side, I'm going to pop in an A2 panel of heavyweight Kraft cardstock, close my embossing folder, and for my sandwich here, I'm just going to grab my top plate. Make sure you're following your instructions with your particular die cutting machine for a 3D embossing folder. I don't actually have the Spellbinders additional plates for 3D embossing folders, but I found that this sandwich worked well with my Spellbinders Platinum. This is just the Jane Davenport version. So I ran that through. You can see now all the recessed areas are now inked up, which is awesome. Now we're going to add a little bit more depth, a little bit more interest. I have Vintage Photo Distress Oxide here, and I'm just going to ink up some of the areas of this wood grain texture. I also love that this wood grain texture is kind of at an angle. That's something a little bit different, and I love that. I think it adds a different kind of energy to the background. You can see here I'm just picking out some areas to kind of ink up and give a little gradation to with that Vintage Photo, and this is really adding a more realistic look, or even more realistic look I should say, to that wood grain and adding some warmth and some more depth. Now that I finished that background, we're going to move on to our focal point. We're going to use the new lovely layered trees to create a focal point for our card. I'm grabbing the largest tree here that has 3 dies to create that, to complete that tree. I'm going to start with the base for that tree and die cut it out of some really dark green cardstock. Then I'll move on to the detail layer for the tree, and I'm going to die cut it out of some olivey colored cardstock, and then I'll finish with the trunk, and we're just going to die cut this out of some brown cardstock. We will do a little ink blending on some of these layers as well to add some more additional depth, but just let alone it creates a gorgeous tree. So now we're moving on to the ink blending. This is Rustic Wilderness Distress ink, and I'm going to ink blend with my blending tool just kind of selectively here. I'm holding my blending tool at an angle, so I just ink blend little kind of branches of this detail layer for this tree. And this is by not ink blending the whole thing with the gradation, we're kind of creating a more realistic look. It's very easy to do, and it just is going to add a lot of texture to this tree. Then for the base, I'm going to ink blend just a little gradation here with black soot at the bottom. Just adds a little bit more depth to that back layer. Now we're ready to put our tree together. I'm going to start by adding liquid adhesive to the back side of the tree trunk, and then I'll just stick it down onto that base. Just make sure I line up that bottom of the trunk with the bottom of the tree. And then for the detail layer, I'm just going to add liquid glue to the backside and then place it on top, kind of sandwiching that tree trunk between the base and the top detail layer. And that will actually complete our tree. I repeated that process 2 more times to create 2 more trees that in the exact same way. And now we have that focal point done. We're now going to move on to our sentiment. This is the Mini Messages sentiment set here. I love this set. I've used it pretty much on every card I've made with this release because I just love it so much. I love a linear sentiment. Pulled out a great sentiment from this set. Going to stamp it onto that same brown cardstock that we used for the tree trunk. I did stamp it in embossing and watermark ink. Now I'm just dipping it into some white embossing powder and then of course heat setting with my heat tool. Love that there is a coordinating die set for that Mini Messages stamp set, and some of the dies are rounded to create a rounded sentiment strip, which I use one of the rounded ones for my sentiment here. I love that little detail. I've been using those rounded ones pretty much constantly. Now I'm going to kind of assemble this card. It's a pretty clean and simple card, even though there's lots of texture. I went ahead and added some liquid adhesive to the backside of our wood grain panel and adhered it to an A2 top folding Kraft card base. Now I'm going to arrange my 3 trees as my focal point. Grab just a piece of low-tack tape to kind of hold them together, and then I'll grab some foam adhesive and add it to the backside just to add a little bit more dimension to that focal point, which creates some beautiful shadows on our card. Once I finish removing the backing here on that foam adhesive, I'll stick those trees down, and then I will remove that tape that just was temporarily holding them in place. Now moving on to our sentiment strip, going to add some foam adhesive to the backside of that as well, and then I'll grab my tweezers here and just place them centered underneath that focal point of trees. And that's our simple card here. Hold up to camera so you can get a good look at all that gorgeous texture. I really love cleaning kind of simple cards with lots of texture. I think that really just allows you to kind of really enjoy all that gorgeous depth that the texture adds. I hope you guys enjoyed today's card and video. If you have any questions about the products I used, please check out the links below in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.